Our series that we launch into today, A Heart Like His, a study in the life of David. If you have a Bible, I'm going to encourage you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel in the Old Testament of your Bible. 1 Samuel, of course, comes right before. You guys are incredible. Nobody knows their Bibles like a City on a Hill church. That's exactly right. 1 Samuel, then 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Chronicles. If you get to those books, you've gone too far. Come back the direction of 1 Samuel chapter 16. Today we embark on this study. We're calling it A Heart Like His. Why study David? Well, one reason would be the vast amount of scripture that is devoted to him. Are you aware of the fact that David's name is mentioned more than 1,000 times in the Bible? Do you realize that based on what's recorded in Scripture, we know more about David's life than any other biblical person except for Jesus? Abraham has 14 chapters devoted to his story. So does Joseph. Jacob has 11. Elijah has 10. But David has 66. 66 chapters devoted to his story. And that's not to mention that there's 59 references to his life in the New Testament. He is a significant person in the pages of our Bible. Now, the average person, you ask them what they remember about David, and they'll recall probably his greatest achievement and his greatest failure. I mean, who doesn't marvel, right? At his incredible victory over the Philistine giant Goliath. That's where we'll be next Sunday. And who can forget his greatest failure, his adulterous affair with Bathsheba? That first exploit marks him as a spirit-filled man who possessed tremendous physical skills. The second exposes him as a lustful man who tragically deceived himself, rationalized his sin, and ended up committing murder. In one essence, those two events capture the essence of David's life. David is a study in contrast, isn't he? Because of his great heart, he often stood head and shoulders above his peers in accomplishing great feats for God, but because of his human weaknesses, he sometimes found himself entangled in a web of sinful behavior. So at some point, we're going to be able to relate to him. We're going to be able to identify with his story. But perhaps most significantly, most importantly, he was the only person in the Bible to be called a man after God's own heart. Can you think of a more stunning description than that? Here's a man filled with inconsistencies and weaknesses like all of us, and yet God singled him out as a man after his own heart. But in saying those words, I really believe that God threw open the door for every person on this planet to be like David. I really believe that God throws open the door for every man or woman to be a person that identifies after the heart of God. In other words, we all have the same opportunities as David to embody in our own way the kind of heart that reflects the characteristics, the emotions, the personality of our God. And so over these next several weeks, we're going to take a closer look at this man. And our goal over these days is to identify the qualities that will give us a heart like his. Today we'll focus on that very first quality. David had a faithful heart. What made him a man after God's own heart? Well, he had a faithful heart. We're going to break down into three traits, three characteristics, but before we do that, let me just provide a little bit of context to our story here today. 1 Samuel 16, you see it there in verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I've rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." Get the picture here, gang. Get the picture. Saul, the very first king of the nation of Israel, is on his way out. His approval rating with God had bottomed out. Through a pattern of persistent rebellion, Saul has hardened his heart towards truth until ultimately the Lord said, "You know what? I don't need this. Enough is enough already." And he rejected Saul as king. And so here at the outset of chapter 16, God is sending Samuel the prophet to seek out Saul's successor. But notice that Samuel isn't exactly chomping at the bit for this assignment, is he? You see, it's always hazardous to anoint a king when Israel already has one. And Samuel was all too well acquainted with Saul's paranoia, and so you can see his reaction there. He said, how can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. Now, God doesn't tell his prophet to be deceptive here, but he does give him an ulterior motive to make the trip. You see that in verse 3, the latter portion of verse 2 and verse 3. The Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord, and then invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one that I indicate. That apparently was good enough for Samuel, so he heads out the door with this heifer in the direction of a town you may have heard of before. Small little burg off the beaten path called Bethlehem. And he goes to the home of Jesse, who had some of the finest sons in all of Israel. When Samuel arrives, he sets it all up, dinner at Jesse's place by invitation only. And so Jesse was there, his sons were there, the elders of Bethlehem were there. There was only one little snag. The most important person in God's sight had not been invited. He wasn't there. Verse 6, when Jesse and his boys arrive, Samuel's thrilled. And he takes one look at the oldest, Eliab, and he immediately concludes, this is definitely kingly material. This must be the guy. Until God says, sorry, that's not him. And the process continues. You can see it there in the text with each of Jesse's sons strutting their stuff in front of Samuel on the red carpet. But every time the results were the same. God said, no, 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 no. And so the prophet is perplexed. I mean, he assumed that all of Jesse's sons were present and accounted for. And Samuel's now out of candidates and still no divine confirmation. He's beginning to wonder, did I hear God correctly? Did I hear the voice of the Lord? Finally, Samuel asks, you wouldn't happen to have any other boys, would you? Jesse rubs his beard. He thought about it for a minute. He said, oh, yeah. There's another, the youngest. He's out tending the sheep. And Samuel says, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. If you're following along in the outline that was provided for you as you walked into the door today, we're going to focus in on three traits of this faithful heart. David had a faithful heart. What can we learn from him? What traits in particular can we make certain that we're making application in our own lives? First of all, trait number one, a faithful heart is consistent when no one else is watching. What was Jesse's assessment of David? He's out watching the sheep. He's out tending the sheep. I'm guessing many of you would be aware, but just so you know, back in the day, being a shepherd was not a distinguished occupation. More often than not, if the family could afford it, they would delegate that dirty assignment to one of the servants. But in Jesse's family, that job fell to the youngest. The Hebrew word for the youngest is katan, but it implies more than age. It suggests rank. The word can also mean insignificant or unimportant. And so in every sense of the word, the katan was the runt of the family. Here in Jesse's family, since David was the katan, he drew the short straw. He was assigned the job of being the family shepherd, which meant that David stood around all day on hard rocks alone, under the hot sun, with sheep as his only companions. Today's equivalent occupation probably something along the lines of a janitor, right? Unless you think I'm being critical of that occupation, please understand I've been there and done that. I've cleaned a lot of toilets in my time. Here's my point. David's life was filled with menial tasks that nobody else wanted to do. But here's the kicker. You ready? He did them with a spirit of devotion towards the Lord. And so when no one was looking, he was faithful even in little things. In fact, not only did he carry out his duties, he far exceeded them by putting his own life on the line to kill a lion and a bear to protect his father's sheep. Did anyone even notice that? God did. Look what Asaph wrote in Psalm 78. He, God, chose David as servant and took him from the sheep pens, from tending the sheep. He brought him to be the shepherd of his people. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with skillful hands. He led them. See that phrase I highlighted? He shepherded them with integrity of heart. In other words, David could be trusted to be honest, dependable, and content with what he was given to do. He guided that flock skillfully. At night, he returned with the same number of sheep that he had gone out with that morning. And so if David could be trusted with sheep out in the fields when no one was watching, God knew that he could trust him to be the shepherd of many lambs, his people in Israel. You with me? Faithfulness in the pasture was transferred to faithfulness in the palace. What does that teach us today? Well, if we want to have a faithful heart, it begins in inconspicuous places, outside of the limelight, where no one is applauding and nobody is patting us on the back. That same principle is actually emphasized over in the New Testament in Luke chapter 16, where Jesus said, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. You see, gang, when it comes right down to it, very rarely does anybody start out with a large stadium ministry or a multi-million-dollar business or a worldwide healing center. No, we start by establishing patterns of righteous behavior in small matters. Paying our bills, being honest in our relationships, following through on our commitments, taking blame when necessary, managing our resources wisely, and above everything else, pursuing the heart of God as we do so. Back in 1 Samuel 13:14, God said, I'm looking for a man after my heart. I'm searching for that person. And on that day, so many years ago, the eyes of the Lord looked up throughout the whole earth and fell upon an obscure little village called Bethlehem, upon an insignificant shepherd boy that everybody else had overlooked. But there, he found a heart, one like unto his own. A faithful heart is consistent when nobody else is watching. Trait number 2, a faithful heart is concerned about the only opinion that matters. It's true, David didn't look as stately as his brothers. You can see it there in verse 12. It tells us that he was ruddy with a fine appearance and handsome features. That's the only physical description that we have of David. He may have had reddish hair, or perhaps he was just red from spending all that time in the sun and the wind. But the point is, nothing about his outward appearance set him apart. And that might have been at least a portion of the reason that Jesse didn't include him, didn't invite him. And yet still, it's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? Can you imagine, gang, being shunned by your own father on such a momentous occasion? I mean, Jesse had been specifically invited to this event and then told to bring his sons because one of them would be anointed as king. Now, it would seem like you'd want to keep all your options open, right? I mean, let's bring all the kids. And his excuse for not having David there, it's lame to say the least. Somebody could have watched those sheep for a little while in David's absence. Which makes us wonder, maybe this was not the only time that David had been excluded from a family gathering. I wonder if this was a pattern. Unless you think I'm being too hard on Jesse here, keep in mind that many commentators actually do agree with that conclusion. Further support appears to come from Psalm 27. This would be a psalm that David wrote. And look what he says in verse 10. Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me. That verse seems to suggest that Jesse, at least to some extent, had written David off. Ever felt that way? Ever found yourself in a situation where you were treated like you didn't exist? Or you weren't wanted? You didn't matter? My guess is you have. Most of us have. I can remember very clearly growing up, there was a stretch of years there where essentially I would have been the runt of the neighborhood, okay? I was the Catan of our neighborhood. And we did this ritual on our street. Maybe you did something similar in your neighborhood as well. If we were going to play baseball, we were going to play football, whatever sport we were playing that day, the best two athletes would be the captains, right? And then we would all stand in a line. And they would alternate back and forth, pointing in our direction to pick their team. You ever done that? Well, the biggest and fastest were always the first to go, right? And then the kids with more limited skills, a little shaky. And eventually they'd get around to picking me. Usually when nobody else was available. But what really hurt is when they began to argue about who had to take you. No, we had him on our team last time. It's your turn. We don't want to lose. You take him. We'll take the three-legged dog instead of him. And I'll never forget it. On that particular day, we were playing baseball. My team was losing in the last inning. There were 2 outs. Bases were loaded. And I was due up to bat. It was at that point that my teammates talked me into saying, my mother is calling and I have to go home. Which I did. I picked up my stuff and walked home. Although I did get some satisfaction. When I looked back over my shoulder as I was walking away, I saw the guy who was pinch hitting for me. He made the last out. That karma gets you every time, doesn't it? Now, why has that scene stuck with me all these years? Probably the same reason many of you have similar memories. Most of us have felt the sting of the world system choosing the biggest, brightest, and most beautiful. And even the prophet Samuel had to be reminded here, didn't he? God had to tell him, Samuel, don't consider their appearance. Ignore their height. The Lord doesn't look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. Human eyes saw a gangly teen enter the house smelling like sheep and looking like he needed a bath. Samuel waited. He wanted to make sure. Finally, in verse 12, God spoke. He said, that's the guy. That's him. Rise up and anoint him. He's the one. And at that point, the old man hobbled over and poured oil on David's head. Josephus, the Jewish historian, said that as he did so, Samuel the aged whispered in his ear the meaning of the symbol, you will be the next king. How do you think Jesse and the boys are feeling right about now? Him? Are you kidding me? Somebody's making a big mistake here. David tuned it all out because he had a faithful heart. He concentrated and took his worth from the only opinion that mattered. There was no mistake. God had chosen David. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looked at the heart. Those words were written for the Catons of society, for the misfits and outcasts that the world has written off. God has a place for them in his kingdom work. God uses them all. In the eyes of the world, the choice makes no sense. But God doesn't make his selections based on the world's system. He makes his selections based on his grace. Check it out over in the New Testament. Paul wrote this, "My dear friends, remember what you were when God chose you. The people of this world didn't think that many of you were wise. Only a few of you were in places of power, and not many of you came from important families. But God chose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. Of this world to put the wise to shame. He chose the weak things of this world to put the powerful to shame. What the world thinks is worthless, useless, and nothing at all is what God has used to destroy what the world considers important. God did all this to keep anyone from bragging to him." Can you grab a hold of that today? God called you. God called me. He knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe nobody else wants us. Maybe your family wasn't the best family growing up. Maybe you were rejected or abandoned. Could be physically, could be emotionally. Though others might have rejected you, forsaken you, discarded you, the good news is you have a Father in heaven who receives you, who welcomes you, who chooses you. There's a place on God's team for every one of us. So quit worrying about what other people think. Their opinion is not nearly as important as the one that counts. A faithful heart is consistent when nobody else is looking. A faithful heart is concerned about the only opinion that matters. Finally, trait number 3, a faithful heart is consumed with pursuing intimacy with God. How did David react to this big announcement? I mean, after all, it's not every day that somebody shows up at your house and announces that you're the next king, right? And that would be like the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes people showing up on your doorstep with a check. I mean, at that point, it's like everything has changed, right? Well, not for David. What did David do? I like the way Chuck Swindoll expressed it. He said, David didn't go down to the nearest department store to try on crowns. He didn't order a new set of business cards telling the printer to change it from shepherd to king-elect. He didn't have a badge made up that said, there's a new sheriff in town. He didn't shine up a chariot and race through the streets of Bethlehem yelling, I'm God's choice, you're looking at Saul's replacement. David did none of the above. No, the reality is he went back to the fields. And you can see that at verse 19, chapter 16, verse 19. Later, when he was summoned into King Saul's service, the last 3 words of that verse tell us that he was with the sheep. David returned to his responsibilities. He went back to his duties. As far as he was concerned, nothing had changed. Man's accolades didn't mean a thing to him. It made no difference as Samuel had anointed him with oil. He didn't expect special treatment from others. No, he went back to doing what he was supposed to do. But you know what? I think he did so for a reason. I really believe that the shepherd was starting to understand that the small days are there for a reason. In the midst of those long, lonely hours, David came to a realization that he wasn't wasting his time. On the contrary, he invested that time into a growing, dynamic relationship with God. I like the way one commentator stated it. They said, every ounce of David's identity, value, and success was established in his being loved by God and being a lover of God. Nothing more, nothing less. And we're going to watch that pattern now. We're going to watch that pattern develop throughout his life. You see, when David received this prophetic word from Samuel, when he was anointed, he was more than likely a young teenager. Most scholars believe that he didn't become king for another 20 years. Can you imagine, gang? For the next 2 decades, David patiently waited for God's promise to be fulfilled. A lot of people would stew in anger during those years. A lot of people would get upset, frustrated. Most people would anxiously wait for their chance to leave the grubby task and to get on to the big stuff, right? David saw it as an opportunity to sink his roots deep into the character of God. He made it a priority to pursue intimacy with God. You say, Gary, how do you know that? Well, in part, I know because David is responsible for a good portion of our Old Testament. This book of Psalms, it's the hymn book of the Old Testament. What they use many times to express their worship to God. There's 150 psalms that make up that book. David wrote at least 73 of them. 73 of the Psalms can be attributed to David. And it's not only what the volume of what he wrote, but the content that makes up those Psalms. Let me give you just a couple of examples here. Psalm 57:7, King James Version, my heart is fixed, O God. My heart is fixed. I love that. He's saying, I know what I believe. I know what matters, and I'm fixed. I am locked in, God. Or how about this one? Psalm 27, verse 4. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. Don't miss that phrase, one thing, right? That was his priority. One thing. This is what I'm pursuing. That's why David was a man after God's own heart. His heart was fixed on the Lord. He kept that one thing his primary goal. David, for all of his faults, found satisfaction in his relationship with God. He was consumed with pursuing him. Finally, let me give you one more here. Psalm 42, 1 and 2. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When can I go and meet with God? Few people have learned to draw on God's resources as often and as desperately as David did. Bottom line this morning, gang, bottom line. The Lord saw what no one else saw. God saw a seeking heart, a faithful heart. And in the end, that's all that God wanted or needed. Others might measure your waist size or your wallet. Not God. He examines our hearts. And when he finds one set on him, he calls it and he claims it. Can we make it our goal here at the outset of this study? Can we make it our goal to have a faithful heart? What if we started to pray like this? God, give me a heart like David. A heart that consistently serves even when no one else is looking. God, give me a heart that doesn't worry about the opinions of man. I'm going to take my value from what you think. And finally, God, give me a heart that pursues intimacy with you above everything else. I want to absorb the lessons of the desert. In those mundane moments, I want to draw close to you so that you can use me in those seasons, to shape me and mold me for whatever assignment is next for me. As we begin this series, as we launch out into this study of David's life, I would encourage you to pray along those lines. We're going to close this morning, reminder in song, that we have a Father. We have a Father who knows our name. We have a Father who chose us, selected us to be part of his family, to be a part of his team. We can take great confidence in that today. Will you stand as Pastor Gerald leads us?